Now 4:11, maybe we'll go ahead. And for the few of you who did not hear Jackson and I whispered discussion about the introduction. Hi, I'm Year 11, I, along with Helen Haste, am one of the co-conveners of the Somerville Moral Education Initiative. We're really glad that you're here for our second colloquium, right, of this semester? I think that's right. And we will be sending around a sheet of paper for if you want to find out about other colloquia, other talks that we have. We have one coming up in just a couple of weeks on global education and thinking about sort of curriculum for global education, which will be a really fascinating panel discussion with Fernando Reimers and Connie Chung and Sarah Dryden Peterson
and Peter Chopra.
Great, and Peter Chopra, and that's what date?
17th of October, at lunchtime one. We're combining with CIS.
So we invite you to that. Then also on November 2nd, was it?
Yes.
We have Jarvis Gibbons, one of our new postdocs here, who will be talking about African American educational sort of approaches at the turn of the 20th century and thinking about actually the links to progressivism and how it's sort of thinking about anyway how both internally to African American education, thinking about African American education and sort of influences on progressive education policy and curriculum at large, which will be really interesting. We then also have a talk later in December. Do we have another one in November?
No, we have no.
Okay. All right.
We've got effectively two in December if you count the S Catholic.
Right. And so then we have 2 in December. Anyway, so we would encourage you to get on our mailing list if you want to hear more and hear also about civic and moral education events and opportunities here at Harvard, in the Boston area, and sort of around the world, because we tend to get a lot of invitations, job postings, conference calls for papers, things like that. But anyway, today I'm really excited that we have Jack Schneider here, and we realize we can if we turn on this front one, I think that does it. Then you can also see.
Oh, sure.
There we are. So we have Jack Schneider here to talk to us about building a better measure of school quality. And I think as Jack talks to us, it will become quite apparent why this fits into the Civic and Moral Education Initiative. So there is that connection, which you'll see very quickly. I'm also just thrilled that Jack is here talking to us because he is one of the most interesting researchers who I talked to in the course of my life. He thinks really broadly and really deeply, really synthetically. You'll see these sort of parts in his work and his presentation today, I'm sure. There were features of his first 2 books, one of which thought really creatively and interestingly about how research does or does not affect policy, and sort of developing sort of a conceptual model grounded in some historical analysis about that. His first book about school reform over the past 30 years, which was one of the books that I actually turned to when I was first trying to get my head around teaching, actually, or foundations of urban education, as well as teaching from STEM, and trying to get a handle on school reform. And he has a book coming out this coming August from Harvard University Press that is a title to be named later, A School Quality Field Guide for Parents, Policymakers, and the Public. The work he's going to talk about today relates to his newest job title as being Research Director of the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Educational Assessment. But his day job is also serving as a professor at Holy Cross in Worcester. And so then after, I forgot to talk to you, Julia, about how you wanted to be introduced. I really apologize. This is a problem running from one. So after Jack presents, which will be about 35 to 40 minutes, then we'll hear from Julia Jeffries, who's a first-year doctoral student here at the Ed School. What else would you like the group to know about your background?
I'm interested broadly in school choice policy and how it's used as a proxy often for equity in terms of how we think about policy. So I'm really excited to hear how Jack's conversations with parents and other stakeholders in the community have come into play in terms of how we think about school quality.
Right, and you're currently a research associate with
Nancy Hill.
With Nancy here,
here at
looking here in Boston. And then that we'll have a good half hour, we hope, for real Q&A, discussion, etc. And so she's going to start writing that down. I'll hand it over to Jack.
Thank you, Mary. If you ever get sick of being a professor of education, you have a future in PR.
Yeah, I don't think so.
So I'm going to skip over a lot of detail today, and my hope is that whatever you are interested in unpacking, we can do at the end. But I'll just try to give you a big overview of this project that I've been working on for the past 2 or 3 years, and a sense of where we're headed right now. So I think I point over here. Yeah. So the core question that guides a lot of this work is, how are our schools doing? And it's a question that's of concern for parents, policymakers, and the public. As Mira mentioned when she alluded to the title of or the part that comes after the colon in the title of my forthcoming book, the part that comes before the colon is to be determined. But so, these are fairly obvious stakeholder groups. Just most obviously, parents are searching for schools. Boston, Somerville, there are a number of districts around here that allow some measure of choice, which would lead parents to seek information about school quality. Policymakers obviously want information about school quality, and so from the local level, we have school committees that are interested in learning how the schools are doing so that they can set their goals. I'll give you an example from Somerville. The school committee in Somerville set, I forget, 5 major goals a few years ago, and their number 1 goal was to support the whole child. And then in terms of their specific targets for that, they had nothing. And then their number 2 goal was to advance academic learning, and they had 8 specific benchmarks that they wanted the schools to meet. But of course, there are also policymakers at the state and federal level who are interested in knowing how the schools are doing and who rely on data to make those decisions for a number of reasons, but probably the leading reason being that someone at the state level cannot go and actually see every single school with the level of detail that would be required to truly understand the school. And then members of the public who are interested in how their tax dollars are being spent, how their community is educating its children. Okay, so what answers do we have? Right now, direct experience, there's a lot of interesting research that talks about how people process their direct experience in schools and how they use observations, anecdotal evidence from their children, direct observation of their children to try to build understandings of how their schools are doing. There's also word of mouth. So this would be more anecdotal evidence, but coming not from their own children, but from peers. And then, again, some really interesting research. So one person whose research jumps to mind is Jennifer Jellison-Holm, who's at UT Austin, who has done work looking at networks of parents and how parents tend to rely on other parents like them when they are looking for information about school quality, which has its obvious benefits and obvious problems in terms of the kind of things that you're going to be queuing into when you're looking for measures of school quality. And then there's educational data. So we're going to talk primarily about the data piece today. And I'll pull up what the profiles page looks like here in the state of Massachusetts. So this is for Somerville. It's last year's data. And as you can see here, it's not a particularly snappy website, right? That's like one of the things that we'll actually talk about briefly today, but it's something that I'm deeply interested in, is the degree to which design is a complete afterthought, as if design has nothing to do with the way that people engage in learning. As if they will be guided by some, internal fire for knowledge, and that plus, enough time will yield the ability to process this. But in addition to design, right, there are also, the absence of design, rather, there are also some very conscious choices being made here. And so you can see, this is MCAS, this is MCAS, this is MCAS, this is MCAS, this is MCAS. This is not MCAS. This is the number of students who took MCAS. This is based on MCAS. This is based on MCAS. And this is the number of students. right? So this is all MCAS testing. Now, obviously, the tab is MCAS tests, but you can see this is MCAS, 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 and then you've got SAT, AP, participation, right? Most of the data is on MCAS. And then in terms of the MCAS data, what you can see is SGP is not a completely terrible measure, right? It's the state's effort to try to measure test score growth based on where students were once upon a time in their testing histories, how they are doing relative to other students with similar testing histories. But there's no explanation of what SGP is or why it would be important, and it's relegated off to this sidebar here where we get real emphasis on raw scores. And we'll touch briefly on why raw scores are problematic, but my sense is that this audience probably doesn't need to unpack that very much. So that obviously is a website that parents tend not to use. In fact, I'll go back for 1 second. I asked the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education to share with me the number of hits that their school profiles pages were getting. And a website that I'll show you that I had a hand in designing had something like 100 times the hits when it was first unveiled, and then continued to get more hits than it. I couldn't get the numbers from the Boston Globe or from a couple of the others that I'll show you, but my guess is they also are getting orders of magnitude greater visitations. And why? Well, there's at least a nod towards design here, and they are trying to simplify this, but of course in their effort to simplify things, they are rank ordering schools by their MCAS scores, right? This is the default. And so when parents look for information about school quality, and a lot of the work that I've been doing lately has been in, so we just ran a series of focus groups. We asked parents, how do you get your information about school quality? Several of them mentioned websites, and most of them said, well, I go on, I Google, school performance and then the name of the school. And they said, one of them, I get the Boston Globe, another, I get Great Schools. She couldn't remember what it was. Great Schools something. That's greatschools.org, which, yes, the .org sends a message that they're this completely impartial, possibly government-run organization. Neither is true. And Great Schools also has its own effort to use design and to try to interpret data for parents. But the 5-star ranking system, for instance, is problematic. There's another website called niche.com, and they also have been thinking about how they might do more than offer test scores, because of course there's increasing work being done investigating what parents and the public are interested in knowing about schools, not just by the Kaplan survey, which has been doing a lot of work on this for the last couple of years, but also by researchers. And it turns out parents are really interested in things other than test scores, and actually work by folks, including Marty West here, has shown that parents already know what the test scores are. Even if they haven't looked at them, they can guess them. And so niche.com, one of the ways they've tried to go beyond test scores is they've allowed users to engage in a Yelp-style rating of schools, which theoretically doesn't sound too problematic until you click the methodology tab, which I may be the only person to have ever clicked, and you find that a score goes live once 9 users have rated the school. So imagine you have a school, it's got 500 students, 9 of them have decided to rate their school and write reviews of it. Why these 9? You can probably imagine which 9 students have gone on to write these reviews. Those scores then become public. So this is a moral and ethical issue, because those scores will of course guide people's decisions if they had been, and they are not, but had they been built into a policy framework, for instance, they would lead to consequences for schools. This is the website that I had a hand in, and I won't tell you the long and funny version of the story, other than that the Boston Globe released a tool called the Dreamtown Finder. And one of the variables in Dreamtown Finder was how much you care about school quality. And so when I went on, because I am a sucker who gets lured into things like this, and I was playing with it, and I said, yes, I care about schools, and I care about these other things, and I don't care about this thing, it said, you should move to Cambridge. And I thought, well, I moved to Cambridge, and then I tried something different. I said, you should move to Arlington. Arlington, I'm getting further away from home. I live in Somerville. And I played and played. I couldn't get it to tell me to live in Somerville, where I'm quite happy, by the way, where my daughter is in the public schools, until I dropped my concern with school quality down to 0. And I said, you should live in Somerville. Like, if you don't care at all about schools, this would match your interests. So I again clicked on the methodology tab, and they were using SAT scores and possibly the total number of adult employees in the district divided by the number of students, something that isn't even average class size. And so I did what any engaged and thoughtful scholar does. I started sending angry tweets at them, and then they, really shrewdly wrote me an email and said, dear Professor Schneider, we see that you're quite upset. Do you have a better idea? Would you like, and so, however many hours later, all we did was we just looked at the data available. I won't flash all the way back to the school profiles page, but if you really weed through that poorly organized page, one of the phrases that I like, and of course I'll forget who used the phrase, whose phrase, it's his name, David Schenk. The phrase is data smog. And so if you're able to weed through all of the data, you can find some things that actually do tell you a little something about the school. And so what we did is we just waded through, found the data, and then brought it up to the surface for people. And then in order to avoid some very basic pitfalls, like rank ordering schools, which sends a clear message that some schools are good, a bunch of schools are adequate, and then perhaps the majority of them are just terrible. Right? You don't want to send your kid to the 537th ranked elementary school. Never mind the fact that there might be 800 great elementary schools, and it's 537 with a hair's breadth separating them from number 1 on a fairly arbitrary measure. Anyway, so we avoided that, for instance, by having people rank their preferences here. By doing that, you just avoid the creation of a single list, or to borrow a phrase from one of my mentors, David Tyack. You don't end up with one best school. And so we built this system, and I encouraged them to call it the less crappy use of state data finder. They did not think that that would lead to eyeballs on the website, and so they called it the Dream School Finder, which I saw that go live, and I begged them, please, whatever you do, don't call it the Dream School Finder. I said, no, it's already up, it's done, there's nothing, it's the internet, it's written in stone, apparently. They couldn't go on. No, it's already up, we can't change it. I said, okay, well, if you do nothing else, please don't run an article where you weight all of the variables equally and then produce a ranked ordered list of the top 10 schools. Top 15 schools in Massachusetts, which they promptly did. I think maybe I gave them the idea and telling them not to do that, which led to some conversations because, surprisingly, the 15th ranked, or maybe it was in the top 10, high school in the state of Massachusetts was a school that has never cracked the top 100 for raw MCAS scores, and that would be Somerville High School. So this led to some conversations. I'll just skip forward so you don't have to look at the Dream School Finder anymore. Which led to some conversations in Somerville about how a different school rating methodology might more fairly and more accurately capture the work that was being done in the schools. People in Somerville, and I'm talking specifically right now about educators, teachers, principals, district administrators, did not seem surprised by any of the data that they saw. They were just surprised that anybody would think to list those things, to include those as variables. None of them felt like the schools were being portrayed, in a biased light, right, an unfairly positive light. It was data; they could back it up. They were just really surprised that they were being recognized. So this led to some conversations about the limits of current data, because one of the things that people wanted to know was, if Professor Schneider, you think you've created the Dream School Finder, you think you're so smart and so special. This was actually what somebody said to me. But your Dream School Finder just uses the not crappy stuff on the state profiles webpage. That's not a Dream School Finder. I said, the less crappy use of state data finder is actually the correct title. But we started talking about, what would a data system that actually captured school quality look like? And we kept running into the limits of available data. And so we were talking primarily about what school qualities are not currently captured, right? So this would be stuff like school culture, social and emotional outcomes. But then also about whether or not we're actually measuring schools with a lot of the data that we're collecting, right? So there's a lot of compelling research about the relationship, for instance, between parental education or family income and test scores, right? Sean Reardon's got this fabulous infographic where he's plotted, he and his team have plotted every single district in America with their test scores and then the median income there, and there is like a beautiful straight line going up across the screen. So I just want to talk a little bit about the consequences of these narrow measures, which I alluded to earlier as a moral and ethical issue. And just to list some very obvious consequences, right? One is that schools are not dumb, that they will adjust to whatever the measurement is, and they will play whatever game they're being asked to play, particularly when the stakes are high. And so one of the things that we've seen is curricular narrowing because, of course, we're only testing students in grades 3 through 8 and then grade 10 in English language arts and math, as well as science at a couple of dipstick points. Not surprisingly, nationally, we've seen declines in art, music, and social studies in terms of time on task in the curriculum. And then there's also the point about who this is being done to, and we see that, for instance, I just cherry-picked a statistic here, 10% of students of color have no recess. I think their white counterparts, that's true of only about, I think the figure was 1%. There's also the issue of stigmas and sanctions, right? So in Massachusetts, we've got level 5 status that not only is a major stigma, right? Lawrence is a level 5 school. I teach students who come from Lawrence and who are literally too embarrassed to say that when I ask where students have come from. Don't want to say that they're from Lawrence. They say, I'm from, sort of north central Massachusetts, northwestern, northeastern Massachusetts, depending on if it's Lawrence or Holyoke or wherever they're talking about. Often don't want to say that. And then there's also the fact that they enter into state receivership and lose their autonomy. And of course, this is tied to test scores, right? So where they're falling in terms of performance relative to other schools. And then, another phenomenon that is currently getting a lot of press, and that would be teaching of the test, right? So the Gallup poll asked people to comment on the amount of standardized testing, and 64% of Americans said there is too much emphasis on standardized tests. Again, schools are not doing this because they believe, well, I shouldn't say all schools, right? But many schools are not engaging in these practices because they believe that it is the right thing to do for children and that it's the right way to educate children. They're doing it because this is how they're being evaluated, and if the way to produce better scores is to game the system, then they will engage in some degree of gaming. And it actually leads to questions about how ethical cheating is versus, say, curricular narrowing, right? You don't get in trouble if you narrow the curriculum, but you could go to jail, right? As Atlanta shows us, if you actually are just fudging the scores. But which one is worse for children? So some questions about measurement, and I've alluded to some of these already. So first, can it capture the things we care about? Second, can it be separated from family income? And third, can it be fair to all schools? And by fair to all schools, what I mean here is, if every school is good, can the data system show that every school is good, rather than simply separating schools into quintiles, for instance, which is a common practice, where we say these schools finished in the top 20%, these schools finished in the bottom 20%, never mind the fact that schools do not naturally separate out into 5 groups of equal numbers relative to their quality. So I'll talk a little bit now about the work that I've been doing in Somerville. So the first thing that we did was try to build a framework for school quality, and I'll put the framework up, and then I'll tell you a little bit about how we developed it. So as opposed to the Dream School Finder, or again, the less crappy use of State Data Finder, we didn't want to just look at what measures are available or what measures would be easy to get and then work backwards to try to justify the use of those. What we wanted to do instead was figure out what people actually care about and what matters to them, and then work forward and try to figure out how to measure those things. And so we began with research done actually by somebody who joined our research team So Rebecca Jacobson, who's at Michigan State University, I found because she wrote this like overly generous, she must have been drinking when she wrote a review of my first book. And so I emailed her and said, who are you and why are you so nice? And in order to get her email address, I found her website and I saw what she was working on. I thought, oh my gosh, this person knows more about my project than I do. So she joined the team. She had written a book along with Richard Rothstein and Tamara Wilder called Grading, I think it's called Grading Education, Getting Accountability Right. And they had done a lot of polling of the public. One of the things they had done, for instance, they had a representative panel of 1,000 people and asked them to rate their values in education. So we built on some existing work there, looked at existing polling from Kaplan, from Pew Research, from Gallup, other organizations. And then we tried to work also with the educational research on some of these variables that people were defining as important in two ways. One, to try to collapse like things together. So if two constructs, for instance, tended to reinforce each other in some extremely tight way, we tended to group them together. And then also to create a kind of nested hierarchy, which you'll see in a moment. And then what we did was we went to the community. And so we held focus groups with roughly a quarter of the teachers in Somerville, with all of the principals, with all of the key district administrators. And I think we held 5 or 6 focus groups with parents, one of which was conducted in, I believe, 4 different languages. So, I'll take you back. So you can see we've divided these into essential inputs and key outcomes. The inputs are relatively independent: teaching in the teaching environment, school culture, and then resources. But of course, there's going to be some overlap there. For instance, a school with a positive school culture is going to be a more attractive place for teachers to work. It'll be more likely to retain those teachers, right? So you can't really have completely independent inputs. And we're measuring this right now because we've got data from the past 2 years on the schools. And then we've got relatively independent outcomes. So we have indicators of academic learning, character and well-being outcomes. Again, there's going to be some overlap between these. But again, there's also some research that has shown us that schools, for instance, can produce students who have positive citizenship traits, who graduate, who go on to college, who are socially and emotionally healthy, but whose test scores did not move substantially across their time at that school. And so we have this model where we are trying to measure inputs and outcomes. Because, of course, you can arrive at these outcomes a number of different ways. We want to know how you arrived at those outcomes. Because ideally, a data system should not only be useful for knowing how a school is performing, but also why a school is performing the way it is. All right? If one of the goals is to empower parents and policymakers and educators to make data-driven decisions, to use a faddish phrase, they need to know what's working and what's not working in terms of the pursuit of their aims. So how do you measure these things, right? This is a lot to try to go after, and very little of it is currently measured by the state, at least not in a totally responsible way. So I'll take you on a close-up of one of them. So school culture, for instance, is divided into safety, relationships, and academic orientation. And I will completely skip why that is right now for the sake of time. But I can tell you that each of those subcategories then has 2 measures. And what we tried to do in our measures was to have one, at least, that could be collected independently of a perception survey. Right? We lean very heavily on student and teacher perception surveys for a lot of this stuff. One of the phrases that I tend to use with people is that a lot of this stuff isn't actually that hard to collect data on. All you have to do is ask people, but at the same time, you do also want to verify that. And so, for instance, student physical safety, that is something that we can count in Somerville, and we're learning how to count that. And then bullying and trust is based on a teacher perception survey as well as a student perception survey. And this is an example of that for academic orientation, where we're looking at the chronic absence rate on-time graduation rates, and then an academic press scale that we have delivered to students. And one of the many things we won't talk about is an experimental pilot that we did using text messaging as a survey delivery system for students, because I hypothesized that if you ask students questions on the right day, you'll get better scores than if you ask them on the wrong day. And so maybe if you asked all the students every day and asked each student a different question that was randomly assigned, you would have a picture of the whole year. And you could actually see what the ups and downs were. There are other reasons too. Our survey is pretty long, and students and teachers alike tend to suffer from survey fatigue. We have an open comments box at the bottom, which I try not to read because it makes me feel bad. Why did you make me spend an hour of my life doing this? And I want to respond and say, so you have a voice. But that's not always what it feels like when you sit for a really long time and do a survey, whereas texting takes, 5 seconds a day. We did it 5 days a week during the school year, only while school was in session. And for that small pilot, I said we weren't going to talk about this. I guess we're talking about it. For that small pilot, we had an extremely high response rate. So data collection procedure, student perception surveys, teacher perception surveys, district administrative data. And the student perception surveys were largely a one-shot survey, although we did do that pilot test with the text messaging. We also collected state data. So this is the other side, right? So we collected the data, and then the next challenge is, well, how do you present it to parents and policymakers and the public in an intelligible way? And so I took some snapshots of the web system that we've currently built, and this is still in development. So you can click on any of the 5 major categories, each of which has a very basic explanation of the category in the form of a question. So school culture, is there a safe and nurturing academic environment? To try to help people, whether they are novices or experts, but primarily trying to help novices navigate this site. So you can click in on that and see for school culture. And I've put together a couple different pages here. So on this school culture page, you can then click on academic orientation, safety, or relationships to produce these pages. We won't go into the color coding scheme here. There isn't time for it, but I can tell you that it's one of the things that is proving to be the hardest, and I think that ultimately might be one of the most rewarding, and that is we're trying to figure out what an absolute standard is and trying to include the community in setting that standard. And so the green zone represents what we are temporarily calling the approval zone. And so that was based on focus groups with parents and educators, so teachers, district administrators, and principals, on what they would like to see the whole community achieving for particular variables. And then trying to figure out where the school is performing in terms of that zone. And then you can dive down deeper on those to see the results for individual questions. And so this is how it looks until you click show histogram, and we've got to figure out a better phrase for that because show histogram is not a completely intuitive phrase for most people. And even though it seems really, I would click on that. And so here's what happens when you show histogram, and we're getting closer in terms of finding visuals that convey data to people in a way that you could almost skip reading everything associated with it, right? That this is the most common response to this question. Unless this is a bad response, or unless this is a negative-oriented question, then this is a fantastic result. And the question is, how friendly is your teacher towards you? The mode response, extremely friendly. Number 2, quite friendly. I mean, that just shows, it's like 55 students said quite friendly, but 92 said extremely friendly. 3 students, not at all friendly. So we are, again, experimenting with how to do this, and right now we're doing some A/B testing with users, and we're continuing to develop this website. Okay, but does this work, right? It sounds great. We collected all this new data, and then we build a new website. What is the impact? Oh, people still go to Boston Globe and get their ratings by looking at raw test scores. Or maybe they'll look at our website and then they come to the same conclusion. So we did a test. We did a modified deliberative poll where we got 50 participants I won't go through all this methodology with you, but it was a stratified random sampling. We had an experimental group and a control group. The experimental group had our new website. The control group had the state profiles webpage. And then we did 4 waves of ratings, and those were a baseline, so no data. 25 people in this room, 25 people in this room, and we asked them, go on this computer, pick the school that you are most familiar with, and then rate it on the following measures. Then we randomly assigned a school to them, the computer system did rather, randomly assigned them a school, and asked them to rate the school, how's it performing on these variables. In the other room, the same thing, no data. Then we gave them data whether they were in the control group or the treatment group. So they got to look at the DESI profiles page or fool around on our website and then do ratings again. Then we had them do small group discussions to see what the impact of possibly not understanding what the data was that they were looking at and having a chance to talk with other people who had looked at the same data. And then we had mixed group discussions to try to see if any of the information was contagious, right? So would people take what they had learned from one data system, share it with the other group in a way that would lead to the other group rating schools differently or weighing in differently on the schools? So here are some of our results. So in terms of stakeholder knowledge, you have a 20%, 16%, that's 30% approximately, increase in how much people learned from the information that was new to them, about how confident they were in what they had learned about those schools, and then the biggest gain was in how useful the information was in allowing them to form an opinion about the schools. The next big result was in perceptions of quality, and we had expected perceptions of quality to change, but we didn't know how it would change, and this one takes a little explanation. So this one, we thought people might be able to weigh in on the quality of the school that we had randomly assigned to them. And of course, retrospectively, that didn't make a tremendous amount of sense, right? It was a school they had no familiarity with. And so most of them just responded, I don't know. We left an I don't know tab. Most of them clicked it for that. So what I think is really interesting is this third rating. And so to remind you, the third rating is after they've had their small group discussions, right? So they've looked at the data, and then they've had small group discussions about the data. And what we see is that if people were familiar with a school, and by the way, I think it's interesting that the ratings went down ever so slightly for even people who were familiar with a school when they looked at the data, indicating they were processing the data in some way. One of my worries at one point was, maybe they just didn't even take our new data into account when they were looking at familiar schools. But, there was a difference here. But here's the most interesting finding, was when somebody was rating a randomly assigned school and working with the state data, their rating was substantially lower than the ratings given by people who were familiar with schools working with either data condition. And so one story that you could tell here is that people who were familiar with a school already understood the school's quality, and so the new data either reinforced it or changed their views slightly, and the state data either reinforced what they knew or changed it slightly. Whereas people who didn't know the school built their perception on the state data, which led to a significantly lower perception of school quality than the perception of people familiar with that school. Unfamiliar raters, when working with the new data, had an average rating that was right in line with the familiar raters. So we are continuing to do follow-up work on this, but again, you can tell a story here, and the story is that good data maybe gives people the kind of understandings of school quality that people familiar with that school already possess. And then the final result from this deliberative poll was in terms of word of mouth. So this is wave 3 to wave 4. This is after they had their mixed group discussions. And we can see that people who were in the new data group, they had worked with the new data system, they got to talk to people who were using the state data system. And it didn't seem like their impression of school quality changed very much. they kind of, one way to tell the story is they kind of knew that already. But the people who were working with the state data, once they had a chance just to talk, they didn't get to see the new data system. They just got to talk with people who had used the new state data system. If they were already familiar with a school, their ratings went up modestly. But if they weren't familiar with a school, their ratings went up fairly substantially. So another story you could tell here is that good information will travel, and that people don't even have to look at it, that you could possibly structure the word of mouth piece, which I mentioned much earlier on, for people so that rather than relying on a combination of test scores and anecdotal evidence, they are relying on something tangible and portable and possibly also accurate. And so at this point, here's what we're doing. We're expanding our scope. So we have the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Education Assessment. And there are 8 districts participating, listed in alphabetical order, but including Boston, as well as Somerville, which continues to do this work. And so we've got a $350,000 appropriation from the state and $1 million from the Gates Foundation, which some of the districts don't want. So we are facing some political challenges internally as well as externally, but we are moving forward, and so we are going to begin building a data system for the consortium. We are going to build a consortium framework from the Somerville framework, adapted for the whole consortium, and then continue this work for the next couple of years, and continue doing some research. Continue doing some research into this. So these are the projects we're already at work on. So looking at the correlates of school quality. So what's the relationship between school culture and social and emotional outcomes? What's the relationship between academic growth and teacher quality? So doing that kind of work. Looking at comprehensive data use in policy and planning. So we've got a Spencer grant right now where we're working on looking at how the new data system is being implemented in Somerville, how it's being used by the district, by the school committee, by principals and by teachers. Looking at whether it's being used, and then if it's being used, how it's being used. We're continuing to do work on school ratings and public perception. How does data, or how do data, shape the way that the public understands the quality of a school? Text messaging is a survey instrument, and then student perceptions and teacher practice. So that's an experiment that we're looking to do, where we're going to give teachers an interpreted version of their student perception surveys for their whole class, and see if that sort of modest nudge leads to any change in teacher practice. So that's what we're doing right now. There should be one more slide. Yep, there it is. There's my email address. And you can tweet at me. Just don't be as mean as I was to the Boston Globe. And so, I think we're going to get some comments here, and then I look forward to having a discussion with all of you.
Great. Thank you. That was really fascinating. One thing that struck me in hearing this was just sort of looking at not the Dream School Finder, but the one that you did in the Somerville framework, was just this notion that parents and students who were participating in the survey were deciding what a good school was to them. And it's sort of like the first thing you mentioned, like how can we broaden what our notion of a good school is? I've been thinking a lot about, the upcoming charter vote in November, and it sort of seems like there's a conversation happening on one side that's saying, on the side of expanding the charter cap, that's saying providing parents with better quality schools is just going to increase choice and increase equity. But there's a lot less conversation about what is actually good about those schools, and if parents actually think those schools are good. Often I've heard statistics that like 83% parents of color say they would rather have their child go to a charter school, but I don't really know what that number is based in and where parents are getting their information from. And so it seems like this is a really interesting framework to allow parents to respond to the question of, well, what is important to you and what does equity mean to you? And I think that was particularly reflected just in the snapshot you gave us of school culture and this sense of, do students feel like they belong in their school and if they're valued in their school, which leads to the question sort of like of civic involvement of students in their school. One of the major things that I wanted to get some more clarity around was sort of the focus groups and conversations that you had with parents and community members in Somerville, because it seems that things that people might respond to on a survey about what they value in a school would be very specific across different contexts, and then that would then change the parameters of like what makes a school good in, say, in a place like Somerville versus like Winchester in terms of like broadening out the research. So I was wondering, so that sort of left me with 3 questions. One is, in the focus groups that you had with parents, was it a kind of back and forth where you and your team would come in and say, here's what we're thinking of in terms of the 3 inputs, like teaching and teacher or environment, school culture, and resources. Here are the things we're thinking of putting in those buckets. What do you all think? And was there a back and forth about what those inputs actually were? If there was a back and forth, I was just curious to know like what parents identified as something that was really salient that you maybe hadn't thought about. My second question was, what were you sort of expecting, or if you've looked into how word of mouth communication between parents and community members in Somerville has changed since you introduced this framework to the community? Because I know that that's often a place where parents get a lot of information. So I'm wondering if this new framework made parents talk to their friends, colleagues about their schools in a different way, and if it made like positively or negatively. And then the third one was just something I touched on a minute ago, which is like, what are the implications for expanding this work to other districts, given that the framework and context of what makes a good school might change in different communities? So are you thinking about having focus groups in all of these communities? Are the survey questions changing at all for both students, teachers, and parents? Yeah, I guess I'll start with those 3.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to try to take these in order I was taking notes here. And then, if you want to follow up. So the first question there is about broadening the notion of a good school. It's a really interesting point that I think so much of this stuff spreads out into different domains, right? So one would be, if we broaden the notion of a good school, there are implications for our democracy, right? So if everybody has a shared understanding of what a good school is, and a complicated understanding of what a good school is, and has some specific language around that, we agree on particular terminology, and we agree on some basics in terms of how we're going to measure this stuff and count it, then it might increase our ability to talk to each other, not just across neighborhoods, but across lines of formal education, across one's status as a parent versus as a policymaker. But then there's also a kind of implication for a very specific policy proposal, which, because I know you have got an interest in this, I'll talk about it, and that would be school choice, right? So if we believe that a school is not uniformly good or bad, then the question becomes, what is the school good at? Which is currently not information that parents have easily at their disposal in a high-quality, portable way. They seek it. Some of them get some information. It maybe is reliable and maybe isn't, and possibly represents a narrow range of experience in a particular school. But if parents actually had that, what might that do to the nature of, the school choice debate, for instance? I'm thinking about question 2 right now, and my take on question 2 right now is that until we have better information for how the schools are doing, I'm not sure how more charters are actually going to change the system in a positive way. But I think my answer becomes different if we have a system that allows schools to have particular strengths and try new things, which actually was one of the original missions of charters, right? That's why Albert Shanker got behind charters, was that they would be laboratories for experimentation, and that some of those experiments would then feed into the system. So if we've got data on that, and if parents can make choices, all of a sudden that conversation changes for me. I'll give you one more place that this will go, and that's it goes into the school integration sector, which is, if you think, gosh, schools aren't uniformly good and they're not uniformly bad, they're good at some things and, maybe fine at other things, right? If that's our goal, and I'll get back to that in a minute, if that's our goal is to have all schools meet a certain threshold across the board and then to just thrive in a particular area or in a couple areas, which needn't necessarily be represented on our current framework. It's not entirely unlike the vision behind magnet schools as a driver of integrated schools, right? Where one of the visions for the magnet school is if you gave parents a reason to be at that school, other than, hey, it's just your generic school, but it's going to be integrated now, you might get more buy-in to the mission of integration. And so there's a little bit of that right now in some systems. So the example of Somerville, there is a school that has a dual language immersion program. And if you were to measure some of the things where that would be scoring through the roof, more people would understand what the unique strengths of that school are. But already people kind of get what's going on there. But it certainly doesn't count for them. They're not rewarded for that. So another piece of this, and then we'll have to move on to the next question, is, how are we going to, this will change how we count school quality in a formal sense, right? How is the state measuring the quality of schools will have to change once we are able to measure schools across a number of different domains. Let me move on to your questions about the focus groups, and then we can take questions. So one of the questions was about methodology. And so the methodology was iterative. And so when we first went to people, we actually were doing something more akin to brainstorming with them. Tell us all the stuff that ought to be on the list. Then what we tried to do is organize those ideas, put like ideas together, put smaller ideas under bigger ideas, and then we came back and said, what's missing? What's not on here? We've got a bunch of stuff on here. What's not on here? What's out of place here? What's on here that shouldn't be on here? And so then we went back and we made more edits, and then we came back again and said, again, what's on here that shouldn't be on here? What's not on here that should be on here? What's out of order here? Where have we situated something as a subcategory when it should be a major category? To answer one of your questions, you said, what did we learn from community members that had not been on our radar? And one piece was about cultural competence of teachers and respect for diversity. And this is speaking to another one of your questions about how Somerville might be different from Winchester. I don't know what things are going to be like in Winchester, but I was surprised at myself for not having preemptively added that one to the list, because of course in a community where you've got dozens of languages spoken, every mailing goes home in English, Spanish, Portuguese, Haitian Creole, and increasingly Korean and Mandarin. Of course, the cultural competency of teachers is going to be something that's important to the community. It may not be shared everywhere. I'm not going to guess what Winchester values or doesn't value. We will actually find that out, because with the consortium, we are going to be doing these focus groups in all 8 of the districts, including redoing them in Somerville. And my vision for this, and I'm not king of the world, so who knows what will actually happen. But my vision for this is that the consortium districts, and this could apply more broadly, will agree on the things that have to be there for a school to be a good school. They will agree on a basket of goods, to use consumer price index terminology. And then beyond that, then they will figure out what they value that is unique to their community. There's an implication here, though, for accountability, for state-level accountability, and for the federal role in building accountability systems, which again is a civic issue, it's a moral and ethical issue, and that's accountability to whom, right? To whom should the schools be accountable? To the parents who send their kids there, to the community that on average nationwide supports the schools with 45% of their funding through local property taxes, to the state, which provides on average, of course it's not true for every state, on average 45% of school funding, to the nation as a whole, which provides on average only about 9% of school funding. Right? So accountable to whom, that will be very contested. But I think that my tentative answer is, well, accountable to the state for the basket of goods, and accountable to the community for the things that the community wants to add to that, that they particularly value, and accountable to parents who are going to be able to speak up more despite possibly low levels of formal education, but despite possibly low levels of ability to interpret data. If the data are really accessible and highly visual, we'll be able to speak up directly to a school principal or to teachers or to band together as parents and say, gosh, we really wish there was more support for the arts at this school, and we can see that there isn't, so let's get active in that area. I think that there was one more, and that's how has word of mouth changed? It's not live yet. It has been given, the system has been given to principals and school improvement councils. So in Massachusetts, there's this, you click around long enough on the state website, you'll eventually find a definition of a school improvement council. And so each school can or should have one, depending on which definition you're reading. And the school improvement councils have been given the tool and are actively using it to structure their school improvement plans, which I've got all these plans as part of our Spencer study. You look at the old ones and it's like, we're going to do all of these incredible things, and how are we going to track? We're going to look at how students are doing, or we're going to count the number of computers we now have. Versus the other stuff, the academic achievement stuff. We are going to have an SGP of 62 instead of 61. We're going to have 38% of students achieving at advanced in 5th grade math versus 29%. So what we're going to track is how specific do their goals get, and how broad do their goals get. Thank you.
So we're going to open it up. Thank you, Julia. That was fantastic. And to Jack for your answers. Before we open it up for questions, I want to note you have a ton of data, and you are looking actively for people who are interested in doing research with you, right?
That's a really good point. So we have all of these ongoing projects, and I teach at a liberal arts college. I love my students. I really like teaching undergrads. They tend not to have highly polished skills, particularly in the area of quantitative research. By the time you've got them trained, they're gone. Yes, we've got a ton of data from the past 2 years. We're going to have an increasing amount of data as the consortium scales up. James Noonan was recently hired to be a current Harvard student, hopefully soon to be former Harvard student, yes, and who is going to be our project director for some of this work. And so I'll pull back those projects. If you have a interest in one of these areas, this is what we've got ongoing, and then because of this treasure trove of data, just lots more stuff that we can be doing. Yeah, thanks, man.
So now, questions?
I have one. Hi. So I'm really curious about the input factors and how actually can we high quality quantitative data of school culture. Like, what does that look like? Because I'm a teacher advocate, so when I go to teachers and I say, hey, here's an input data point, they're going to go, what does that mean?
Yeah. So in terms of school culture, the way we define it, I forget what the one sentence was that I read out. Does the school have a safe and caring environment that is academically oriented? Something like that. And so I would imagine there would be two ways to engage with this. One way would be, and I'll talk specifically to teachers, one way would be for a teacher to look at this data and see very visually, we've got a great school culture, or not. And then to make that a priority or not in a number of different potential avenues for leadership at the school level, right? So if a teacher is on an ILT, an instructional leadership team, then that teacher is working closely with the principal on a more regular basis and is a kind of advisor in many cases to the principal about what his or her priorities should be moving forward for the school. Teachers have a lot of this knowledge already because they're in the building, they're smart, they're paying attention. If you ask them to comment on other teachers' classrooms, they will be unable to, however. There are reams of studies on this, and it is because they are siloed in their own classrooms. They know their own classrooms really well. They do not know what's going on, by and large, in other teachers' classrooms. They know those other teachers. They know if they like them or not. They get a sense about them. So there's certainly stuff they do know about what's going on in other teachers' classrooms, but without systemic support for allowing teachers to visit each other and to, we've got all sorts of initiatives, critical friends and, small learning, the professional learning communities. Until we do that, just giving teachers a way of knowing how what they're doing squares with what the school as a whole is doing, I think is a pretty important input for teachers in terms of empowering them. And then another way I think it could be pretty empowering for teachers is to begin disaggregating the data and looking at individual questions and looking at, eventually we're not there right now because we're moving really slowly. We don't want to scare anybody. So everything right now is aggregated at the school level. And we have not been sharing any results with individual teachers other than, here are the results for the whole school. Thank you very much for participating in this. We are protecting your identity. But, I think eventually in the long game, you will have to build culture around it. You will have to build trust around it. But the long game for this, particularly if you have a more rapid feedback mechanism from student to teacher, the long game is that teachers will know more about all the stuff that is completely invisible to them in their classrooms that they are desperately trying to sense through proxies and through relationships. As a former high school teacher and somebody who teaches people who aren't much older than high schoolers, I look at them, I think I know what's going on in their heads. Sometimes they trust me enough to tell me. But there's a lot of stuff that I simply don't know about what's working, for instance, with school culture. Again, I have proxies for it. I can count the faces of my students and look at, how do kids of color feel in my class? Or do I have more kids of color in my class 5 years in than I did in my first year? So there are proxies for it, but again, it'd be nice to know how culturally competent my students feel that I am, or how safe they feel bringing, diverse backgrounds and experiences to the classroom. So I think it plays out in a couple ways, but certainly others possibly as well. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? You mentioned that a lot of your data is from teacher and student perception surveys. As you start scaling up and moving to bigger other districts, how are you trying to account for reference bias?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So we're trying to think through a number of things, including reference bias, but also including, somebody who appears, right? We can easily identify when somebody has just checked C all the way down, but a response that appears to be a genuine response, but is actually some kind of non-random response, or actually truly random response. So, one of the ways that we are experimenting with it is by using framing vignettes. It's like, there is so much, we are like at the very beginning of this work. I mean, as a field rather than, we are too. When you think about all the things that you need to figure out, including this very basic question of like, what if you give the survey on February 15 versus March 12? I mean, that's like, what a basic question that we have like almost no information about, other than anecdote and personal experience, and so these framing vignettes, for instance, can help people understand. Here's the definition that we are working with for. So if we give a student a question, for instance, about academic challenge, right? To what extent are you being challenged? This is not how we would word a question, but to what extent are you being challenged in your class, right? So if you were, first of all, just to take one step further and say, to what extent does your teacher challenges you to grow every day as a student? Already you're beginning to get past the sort of generic notion of challenge. But also when you can provide a framing vignette, you can say, in this classroom, here's this student. This student is the following way. The teacher challenges this student by doing the following. In your classroom, when you are feeling like you haven't completely mastered a topic, how often does your teacher challenge you to do this? Now, of course, that is going to dramatically extend the length of the survey, but there's also, there are workarounds, right? So administering the framing and vignettes to one group in a school for a certain number of questions, as a means of then benchmarking for the larger group, administering another framing vignette to another group of students, so lengthening the survey just by a little bit for each group. Again, I think this gets easier if you can begin administering questions on a daily basis, which in terms of the technologies there, it's actually a matter of capturing a diverse student body at this point. So we provided free phones and texting to students if they didn't have a phone and a texting plan already. That was a little expensive. So I think we're close, both in terms of like methodological advances and technology, and I'll keep you posted. Give me your email address and I'll email you in 5 years and let you know if we figured it out.
I'm here for 5 years.
Yeah, okay, great. I'll invite me back in 5 years and I'll give you an update.
I have a question. You brought up briefly integration, and I know you think a lot about race and racism, both personally and in your upcoming book. But I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you address both the explicit and often implicit bias that parents bring as they start to rate school quality, particularly in urban communities with lots of students of color and lots of poor kids.
Yeah, right. So that's my. Somebody once asked, what's your secret agenda for this? Everybody has some secret agenda. My secret agenda, which I guess is not going to be a secret anymore, is the integrated schools. Because we were actually talking before 410 about the degree to which parents use race as a proxy for school quality, and then a similar but quite different phenomenon, which is parents using race in their decisions about where they enroll their children. Those two things right now are intimately bound up with each other for a variety of historical, social, economic reasons. I think the first big step is beginning to disentangle those things for people. So there's a lot of research, for instance, about housing preference that shows that on average, whites prefer neighborhoods that are, and then depending on the study you read, somewhere between 50-50 white, non-white, or 2/3 white, 1/3 non-white, and that non-whites are about 50-50 in their preferences. And then what we see in actual neighborhoods is that whites tend to live in neighborhoods that are 80% or more white, and that non-whites tend to live in neighborhoods that are similarly skewed demographically. And there are a lot of complex reasons for this, but one of them is that, well, let me tie it back to schools. We see something similar with schools. And one of the reasons we see this, and we could map backwards to talk about housing, but one of the reasons that we see this with schools is that people are expressing a preference in a world with no other questions, right? If all schools were equal, if all schools were good, what would the racial demography of my school be? But of course, that's not the world that people are making these decisions in. They're making these decisions in a world where they have been led to believe by observation, from the mass media, from word of mouth, from structural racism. They have been led to believe that if a school has a lot of students of color in it, it's not a good school. And so even if they would have sent their kids to a school, if it were a good school, many feel that they can't send their kids there because, I mean, it's a catch-22, right? Like, yes, it has the demography I want, but it can't be a good school. And we actually have heard this from a lot of parents in Somerville who have said, hey, by the way, it's like, this is not formal. We weren't planning on hearing this from people, but who have said, hey, by the way, like, I'm really excited about this because, people keep telling me, like, the Somerville schools can't possibly be good. And they keep saying, like, if you have any evidence that they actually are good, like, we would stay. We wouldn't move. And then they say, like, I've been sending them, I have these spreadsheets where I look at, like, how high-income kids are performing in Somerville versus how high-income kids are. And so I think the first big step is to disentangle those two things so that people can make the kinds of decisions they would make in this theoretical world where all schools are good, which is not to say that all schools are good, but all schools may be a lot better than they're currently being given credit for. And then the second, I think, is a long game that schools have a role to play in, and that's shifting the preference among non-whites to being the same, among whites to being the same as among non-whites, so that the preferences align. It's the misalignment of those that leads to lots of problems with tipping one way or the other. And I think the role schools have to play in that is that when kids go to school together and spend, if we're talking about a K-8 school, spend 9 years. At my daughter's school, she's got 46 kids at her grade level who will hopefully move through the school with her, and that will change her life. And so, I think there's a long game there that if you can actually get people in integrated schools, then creating integrated schools suddenly becomes tremendously easier. So, thank you. Yeah.
Well, go Crusaders. Family connections there. But second, I think you started touching on this just now. But looking at your model, you talk about kind of the inputs there and then the outputs. But one of the inputs I don't think is on, and I could be wrong about this, was kind of incoming achievement level or kind of incoming characteristics of the students, right? So one of the things I think of when I think of a good school is a school that's taking students and moving them beyond kind of where they are, right? You could think of a school that has getting kids in, and I think of high school, I'm not a high school person, but you think a high school is getting in students that are scoring at the 80th percentile, they come out, they're scoring at the 80th percentile, they're probably doing pretty well on your metric, but I would think that they are, in some measures, not doing as well as a school that takes kids coming in at a 40th percentile achievement and getting them to 60 or 70. Right? Their outputs are lower than that other school. Yep. Their inputs certainly are lower, but the fact that they're moving them, in my book, puts them higher. And I'm trying not to make this too methodological, but like that actually is a moral, an ethical question of what should schools be doing, and that's kind of baked into some degree into any one of these kind of models. Right? Which I think is kind of the point of why it's here, but. but there's a stance there, right?
Yeah.
And so how are you kind of thinking about trying to move people's perception of what really is good schools? I don't think often parents are thinking about, like they're just saying, I want my kid to do really well, and that getting my kid to do really well might be different than what might take someone else's.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm going to give you a couple different answers because I think depending on the shade of the question, it becomes a pretty different question. So one version of the question is, you know, and I'm going to skew it here intentionally, is to what extent are you measuring growth versus outcome, right? And so on some measures, we are only looking at growth. So in terms of academic achievement, for instance, and the consortium is going to be measuring academic achievement, we are going to both be looking at MCAS scores, but only looking at growth there. And then also looking at, we're going to be developing performance tasks. And so all consortium schools, by the end of, I think, 3 years, will be doing performance assessments. So these are teacher-rated performance tasks, some being common to the whole consortium and some being chosen by the teachers and then rated in a sort of portfolio style, and then tracking growth on those across a certain number of years. Some of this depends on how long we have funding for. So the simplest answer is when we can measure growth, we are measuring growth. Then there's a different version of this question, and you, I think, intentionally use the word inputs there, right? And so this is like, well, what about inputs rather than outcomes, right? You measure growth and outcomes. What about, like these kids came in with maybe attitudes and behaviors non-conducive to typical schools, which might lead to a low school culture rating. But in fact, they are developing quite positive attitudes towards schools. And so their growth on that is tremendous, but their overall school culture rating is lower than a school with a population that is uniformly, from culture groups and income groups that really match what the school is asking in terms of behavior and attitude, et cetera. That's so complicated. So one way that we are trying to address that is being really intentional about the questions that we ask on, say, student-teacher perception surveys. So, asking a student if he or she feels respected by his or her teachers. I think that one, obviously, you may want to do some framing through vignettes for that, but that, for me, a school is not a good school if kids don't feel respected by their teachers, and I'm not sure that I personally, and I won't speak with my researcher hat on right now, but with my parent hat on, I'm not sure I personally need to see growth stats on that. But there are some where you're right. The implication, if you don't look at where kids are starting, is that maybe the school has something to do with it. It really does get into a kind of moral and ethical place where you're asking, well, what is the school responsible for? And in terms of thinking about what a good school is, do I count it as a good school if the school is moving kids to a certain place, but my kid is already beyond that place? And so the place that I ultimately come to is transparency. And we're not there yet, but cutting the data in a number of different ways for people so that they can get the answers to the questions they have. And ultimately, I think one of the important methodological advancements will be giving people, and this speaks to another twist on your question, and then I'll stop, interpreting your question. I feel like Glenn Gould up here. So another twist on this is, who do I care about? Do I care about my kid, or do I care about all kids, or do I care about generic kid?
Yeah.
So, and I think we haven't gone there yet because there's a lot to think through. We need, some people who think through ethical issues in schools to help us. But, I think there's real power in being able to give people both snapshots. How do kids who are like my kid do at this school, and how do all kids do? But obviously that opens up a really possibly dangerous door, right? Like, wow, this is a great school. I'm never going to send my kid there. And I think the even bigger question that it ultimately raises is, are we comfortable with saying that some schools are good for certain kinds of kids, but not for all kids? And I think we're comfortable with saying that around some things, right? Like, my wife did her student teaching at the High School for Creative and Performing Arts in Philadelphia, where Boys to Men emerged from. Nobody under the age of, I think our age group here may know Boys to Men. My students do not. It made me very sad. I almost started singing for them the other day.
DNC.
Yeah.
CNN literally cut away from protesters to watch them.
So she taught at Kappa, and they've got an entrance exam that is like, if you're a singer, you sing. That's it. And not every kid. It's not the right school for every kid. And that, I think this is a big conversation to have about race and class and religion and values, and I'm not ready to have that conversation, but I think you ask a really good question, and eventually this is where all this stuff goes. And I think, it's just under the rug. It's already the question, right? We may as well bring it out into the open at some point.
Thank you for a totally transparent presentation. It was really true.
Thank you. And if any of you want to keep talking, then I'll put this up one more time so that you can send me an email. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, I'm definitely coming. I'm going to come on stage for a couple minutes.